Detective Lisa Hayes had been on the force for 12 years, and she thought she'd seen everything. But the anonymous call that came in that Tuesday evening felt different somehow. The voice on the other end was shaky, nervous, telling her about suspicious movements at an old warehouse on Riverside Street. The caller wouldn't give a name, just an address and a time. Then the line went dead. Lisa sat in her patrol car outside the warehouse at exactly 8:30. The building looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. Broken windows stared back at her like empty eyes, and rust covered every metal surface. But something caught her attention right away. Fresh tire marks in the dirt leading to a side entrance. Someone had been here recently, and more than once by the look of it. She radioed her position to dispatch and stepped out of the car. The evening air was cool and the street was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Lisa approached the building carefully, her hand resting near her service weapon out of habit. The side door was unlocked, which immediately raised her suspicions. Nobody leaves a door open in an abandoned building unless they're coming back. Inside, the darkness was thick and heavy. Lisa pulled out her flashlight and swept the beam across the space. The warehouse was mostly empty, just some old crates stacked in corners and debris scattered across the concrete floor. Dust particles danced in her flashlight beam. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space, making her feel exposed despite being alone. Then she heard it. Voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building. They were muffled, but definitely there. Lisa moved slowly toward the sound, keeping her footsteps light. Her heart rate picked up slightly, not from fear but from the anticipation that comes with years of experience. Something was definitely happening here. The voices led her to the back of the warehouse where a single door stood closed. Light spilled out from underneath it, a golden glow against the dark concrete. Lisa positioned herself to the side and listened. There were at least 3 people inside, maybe more. They were talking in urgent but hushed tones, the kind of conversation people have when they don't want to be overheard. She couldn't make out the words clearly, but the tone wasn't what she expected. There was no anger, no threat in the voices. Instead, they sounded almost desperate, like people trying to solve a difficult problem. Lisa's instincts told her to wait, to gather more information before making a move. She pressed closer to the door, trying to hear better. That's when she caught fragments of the conversation. Something about documents, photographs, and the word children mentioned several times. Lisa's mind raced through possibilities. Was this human trafficking? A kidnapping ring? The anonymous tip suddenly made more sense if someone on the inside wanted to expose something terrible. But then she heard something that confused her. One of the voices mentioned city officials and cover-ups. Another voice talked about evidence and building safety codes. This wasn't matching any of the scenarios running through her head. What exactly was going on in that room? Lisa knew she should call for backup immediately. That was protocol. But something made her hesitate. If she called it in now, squad cars would arrive with sirens blazing, and whatever was happening here would scatter like shadows. She needed to understand the situation first. She carefully pulled out her phone and texted her partner, Officer James Chen, giving him the address and asking him to come quietly, no lights or sirens. Then she settled in to wait and observe, her eyes fixed on that strip of light under the door. Minutes felt like hours. Lisa heard papers rustling, footsteps moving around the room, and occasional bursts of conversation. She caught more words now: foster care, inspection reports, false records. Her confusion deepened with each fragment she heard. This wasn't sounding like a typical crime scene at all. Suddenly, she heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor inside the room. Then one voice rose above the others, clearly upset. They were arguing about something, about whether they had enough proof, whether it was safe to move forward. Lisa pressed her ear closer to the door. That's when her phone buzzed. A text from James saying he was 5 minutes away. But apparently, Dispatch had also sent backup based on her earlier radio call, and they were pulling up with full lights. Lisa's stomach dropped. She heard the sirens in the distance, getting closer. Inside the room, the voices stopped abruptly. Everything went silent except for those approaching sirens, getting louder with each passing second. The moment the sirens reached the warehouse, everything changed. Lisa heard rapid movement inside the room. Chairs scraping against concrete, papers being shuffled frantically. She had to make a quick decision. Storm in now or wait to see what happened. The sirens grew deafening as 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt outside. Lisa stepped back from the door as it suddenly burst open. 3 people stumbled out, hands raised instinctively, squinting in the harsh beam of her flashlight. The first was a man in his 50s, wearing an expensive-looking suit despite the dusty surroundings. The second was a woman around 40 with determined eyes and a city council pin on her jacket. The third was younger, maybe 30, wearing glasses and carrying a leather folder stuffed with papers. Behind Lisa, 4 officers rushed in with weapons drawn, shouting commands. The warehouse erupted into chaos, voices overlapping. Flashlight beams crossing in the darkness. Lisa held up her hand and called out for everyone to calm down. The 3 people from the room kept their hands raised, but they didn't look scared. They looked frustrated, like their carefully laid plans had just fallen apart. Officer James arrived and took position beside Lisa. He looked at her with a questioning expression, trying to read the situation. Lisa motioned for everyone to lower their weapons. Something in her gut told her this wasn't a threat. These people weren't dangerous. The man in the suit spoke first, his voice steady despite the circumstances. He said they weren't criminals and that they could explain everything. The woman with the council pin nodded vigorously, adding that they were actually trying to stop a crime, not commit one. The younger person with glasses just stood there, clutching that folder like it contained something precious. Lisa asked the backup officers to secure the perimeter but to holster their weapons. Then she turned to the 3 people and asked them to explain exactly what they were doing in an abandoned warehouse in the dark. The man glanced at the other 2, seeming to ask permission without words. They both nodded. His name was David Thornton, and he was a real estate developer. The woman was Patricia Valdez, a city council member. The younger person was Dr. Rebecca Stone, a child psychologist. Lisa recognized Patricia's name from local news, which made this even more confusing. What was a council member doing in a place like this? David started explaining, but Lisa stopped him and suggested they move somewhere with better light. The group walked back into the room they'd been using. It was small, with a battery-powered camping lantern providing the light Lisa had seen under the door. A folding table sat in the center, covered with photographs, documents, and what looked like building blueprints. Lisa examined the table while the 3 people stood nervously to the side. The photographs showed children in various group homes. The documents were inspection reports, financial records, and legal papers. The blueprints were for residential buildings around the city. Nothing about this made sense yet. Patricia stepped forward and said they needed to show Lisa something important. She spread out several photographs of a large house on the north side of town. It looked run down in the pictures, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Patricia explained this was supposed to be a licensed group home for foster children, but the conditions inside were terrible. Dr. Stone joined in, her voice shaking slightly as she described what she'd witnessed during unofficial visits. Kids sleeping 4 to a room meant for 2, mold growing on walls, barely any food in the kitchen. She'd tried reporting it through official channels, but nothing happened. The reports disappeared, inspections got delayed, and the children stayed in those conditions. David picked up the story, explaining how he'd gotten involved. One of the kids from that home had approached him at a community event, slipping him a note asking for help. The boy was brave but scared, and something about that note haunted David. He started digging into the group home's ownership and discovered a web of connections to city officials who were profiting from keeping these places barely functional. That's when Patricia's role became clear. As a council member, she had access to records others couldn't see. She'd noticed discrepancies in funding for foster care facilities, money being allocated but never reaching the homes themselves. When David contacted her with his findings, they realized the problem was much bigger than one bad group home. They'd brought in Dr. Stone because they needed someone who understood child welfare and could document the psychological impact on the kids. Together, they'd been gathering evidence for 3 months, meeting in secret because they didn't know which officials were involved in the scheme. The warehouse was their safe space, somewhere nobody would think to look. Lisa listened to all of this, her mind processing the information. She looked at the documents on the table again, really studying them this time. Financial records showing payments to shell companies, inspection reports that had been altered, photographs of children who deserved so much better than what they were getting. Her jaw tightened. Lisa picked up one of the inspection reports and read through it carefully. The document stated that the group home had passed all safety requirements with flying colors, but the photographs showed a completely different story. Broken railings, exposed wiring, and rooms that clearly violated occupancy limits. Someone had falsified these reports and the children were paying the price. Officer James looked over her shoulder and let out a low whistle. He'd worked juvenile cases before and knew what proper group homes were supposed to look like. This was nowhere close. Lisa asked the 3 people how they'd obtained all this evidence, and their faces fell slightly. David admitted they hadn't exactly followed proper procedures. He'd accessed property records that were technically public, but had to pull some strings to get them quickly. Patricia had used her council credentials to request files that weren't necessarily within her committee's jurisdiction. Dr. Stone had visited the homes without official authorization, pretending to be a volunteer. Lisa understood immediately what this meant. The evidence was solid, but the way it was gathered could be questioned. A good lawyer might get it all thrown out of court. Worse, if the wrong people found out about this investigation before it was official, they'd have time to destroy records and cover their tracks. Patricia seemed to read Lisa's thoughts. She said that's exactly why they were being so careful, meeting in secret and gathering as much proof as possible before going public. They knew they'd only get one shot at this. If they moved too soon with incomplete evidence, the people responsible would walk free, and the children would suffer even more. Lisa asked how many homes were involved. David unfolded a map of the city and pointed to 7 locations, 7 group homes, all connected to the same network of ownership through various shell companies, all receiving government funding, all supposedly meeting safety standards, all actually providing substandard care while the owners pocketed the difference. The scale of it hit Lisa hard. This wasn't just one bad situation. This was systematic neglect affecting dozens of children across the entire city, and city officials were enabling it, either through corruption or willful ignorance. She felt anger rising in her chest, but kept her expression neutral. Dr. Stone opened her folder and pulled out a stack of drawings. They were pictures made by the children, showing their daily lives in these homes. Simple crayon drawings that told complicated stories. Kids drawing empty plates at dinner time. Figures huddled under thin blankets. Broken windows and dark rooms. Each picture was dated and had the child's first name written on it. Lisa picked up one drawing that showed a small figure standing alone in a corner. The child had used only dark colors, black and gray and brown. At the bottom, in careful letters, someone had written, "Please help us." Lisa felt something twist in her stomach. This wasn't just about violations and regulations anymore. These were real children asking for someone to care. James asked the obvious question. Why not just take all this to the police chief or the district attorney? Patricia and David exchanged a look. Then Patricia explained that 2 of the officials they'd identified were closely connected to the district attorney's office. They couldn't risk going through normal channels until they knew who could be trusted. That put Lisa in a difficult position. She was a police officer. She had protocols to follow, chains of command to respect. But she also understood their concern. If they handed everything over and it reached the wrong desk, all this work would be for nothing. The children would remain in danger, and the people responsible would just get better at hiding their activities. The backup officers were still outside, waiting for Lisa's assessment. She needed to make a decision about how to handle this situation. She could arrest all 3 people for trespassing and whatever charges might stick for their unauthorized investigation. She could confiscate all the evidence and turn it over to her superiors. That would be by the book, the safe choice for her career. Or she could take a risk. She could see that these 3 people were genuinely trying to help children who had no one else fighting for them. They'd risked their reputations and possibly their freedom to expose something terrible. Lisa thought about that drawing, the small figure in the corner asking for help. She made her decision. Lisa told the 3 people to pack up everything carefully. Then she turned to James and asked him to dismiss the backup officers, telling them it was a false alarm, just some urban explorers who'd gotten spooked. James hesitated for just a moment, understanding that Lisa was stepping outside normal procedure. Then he nodded and went to handle the other officers. After the other officers left, Lisa sat down at the makeshift table and looked directly at David, Patricia, and Dr. Stone. She told them straight out that what they were doing was risky and potentially illegal in some aspects. But she also admitted that she understood why they'd done it this way. The evidence was compelling and the situation was urgent. However, Lisa explained, if they wanted this to actually result in justice and help for the children, they needed to do things properly from this point forward. That meant getting official warrants, conducting legal investigations, and building a case that would hold up in court. Otherwise, all their work would be wasted. Patricia looked worried. She asked how they could do that without alerting the corrupt officials. Once Lisa started filing paperwork through official channels, word would spread. The people involved would hear about it within days, maybe hours. They'd have time to destroy evidence and create alibis. Lisa thought about this problem for several minutes, while the others waited silently. Then she remembered something. There was a state task force that handled corruption cases involving local officials. They operated independently from city authorities and had the power to conduct investigations without going through local channels. If she could get their attention, they could move fast enough to prevent cover-ups. But there was still the problem of evidence. Everything spread out on this table had been gathered outside official procedures. The task force would need legitimate grounds to open their investigation. Lisa asked if any of the children had made official complaints that were then ignored or buried. Dr. Stone nodded immediately. She'd been keeping careful records of every conversation she'd had with the children. Several of them had told her they'd tried talking to social workers or case managers about conditions in the homes, but nothing ever changed. Those complaints would be documented somewhere in the system, even if they'd been deliberately overlooked. That was the key Lisa needed. If they could show a pattern of ignored complaints combined with falsified inspection reports, that would be enough to trigger a legitimate investigation. The evidence gathered by David, Patricia, and Dr. Stone could then be used to support and expand that official investigation. Lisa pulled out her phone and found the contact information for the state task force. It was late evening, but this couldn't wait. She called the emergency line and explained that she had information about systematic child welfare violations and official corruption. The person on the other end asked her to hold. While Lisa waited, David organized all the documents into categories: financial records in one pile, inspection reports in another, photographs and children's drawings in a third. He worked methodically, like someone who'd spent his career managing complex projects. Patricia helped him, occasionally pointing out connections between different documents. Dr. Stone stood apart, looking at the drawings the children had made. Lisa noticed tears in her eyes. The psychologist had clearly formed real connections with these kids during her visits. This wasn't just a case to her. These were individual children she cared about, each one with a name and a story. The voice came back on Lisa's phone. A supervisor from the task force wanted to know more details. Lisa explained what she'd discovered, being careful about how she described the evidence. She mentioned the anonymous tip that had brought her to the warehouse, the individuals she'd found conducting an unofficial investigation, and the concerning documents they'd compiled. The supervisor asked if Lisa could secure the location and the evidence until task force investigators arrived. Lisa said yes. The supervisor told her a team would be there within 2 hours and that she should let absolutely no one else enter the warehouse in the meantime. This investigation was now officially sealed under state authority. When Lisa hung up, she felt both relief and anxiety. She'd just made a career-defining decision. If this went wrong, if the evidence didn't hold up, or if she'd misread the situation, she could lose her job. But if it went right, dozens of children would get the help they desperately needed. She explained to the others what would happen next. The state task force would take over the investigation. David, Patricia, and Dr. Stone would need to give formal statements and turn over all their evidence. They'd probably face questions about how they obtained that evidence, but the supervisor had indicated they'd focus on the bigger crime rather than minor procedural violations. Patricia asked if the children would be safe in the meantime. That was Lisa's biggest concern, too. If word got out that an investigation was starting, there was a risk that evidence at the actual homes might be destroyed, or that children might be moved to hide problems. Lisa made another call, this time to Child Protective Services. She spoke to a supervisor there and explained that multiple homes might need emergency inspections within the next 48 hours, based on credible concerns. She couldn't give details yet, but she needed assurance that they could mobilize quickly when the time came. The CPS supervisor recognized the urgency in Lisa's voice and agreed to have teams on standby. They'd be ready to move as soon as they received official authorization. The state task force arrived exactly 90 minutes later. 3 investigators in plain clothes showed up with proper credentials and serious expressions. They took over the warehouse, photographing everything and cataloging all the evidence that David, Patricia, and Dr. Stone had gathered. Lisa briefed them thoroughly, including her assessment that these 3 people were witnesses rather than suspects. The lead investigator was a woman named Rachel Kim, who'd spent 20 years working corruption cases. She listened carefully to everything, asking pointed questions but treating everyone with respect. After reviewing the evidence, she told Lisa that she'd made the right call. This was exactly the kind of case the task force was designed to handle. Rachel explained the next steps. They'd verify the evidence, cross-reference it with official records, and build a comprehensive case. But they'd do it quickly and quietly to prevent the suspects from learning about it. She estimated they'd need 48 hours to prepare, then they'd move simultaneously on all fronts. David, Patricia, and Dr. Stone gave their formal statements that night. It took hours, but they answered every question honestly. Rachel seemed impressed by how thorough their documentation was, even if the methods weren't always by the book. She told them their work would save the investigation months of effort. By 3 in the morning, everyone was exhausted but cautiously hopeful. Rachel sent Lisa home with instructions to maintain her normal routine and not discuss the investigation with anyone. The fewer people who knew, the better. Lisa drove home feeling like she'd aged 10 years in one night. The next 2 days were the longest of Lisa's career. She went about her regular duties, responding to calls and filing reports, all while knowing that something massive was about to break. She kept thinking about those children in the drawings, hoping they'd hold on just a little longer. On Thursday morning, everything happened at once. State investigators and Child Protective Services teams executed simultaneous raids on all 7 group homes. Police arrested 5 city officials and 3 property owners. Lisa was part of the team that secured evidence from the main office where financial records were kept. The response was swift and overwhelming. With proper warrants and official authority, investigators found even more evidence than David, Patricia, and Dr. Stone had uncovered: hidden bank accounts, forged documents, and communication records showing the full extent of the corruption. It was all there, and now it would all hold up in court. Most importantly, 31 children were immediately removed from substandard conditions and placed in proper emergency foster care. Social workers and psychologists, including Dr. Stone officially this time, began working with each child to assess their needs and start the healing process. The story broke in the media by Thursday afternoon. News outlets showed footage of officials being led away in handcuffs and explained the scheme to defraud the foster care system. Patricia gave a statement on the courthouse steps, her voice strong as she described the courage it took for the children to speak up and the importance of listening to them. David declined to appear on camera, preferring to let the facts speak for themselves, but he announced through a spokesperson that his company would be donating funds to help renovate several group homes and ensure they met not just minimum standards, but excellent ones. Dr. Stone established a non-profit organization dedicated to monitoring child welfare facilities across the state. She trained volunteers to recognize warning signs and created a hotline where children could report concerns confidentially. Other psychologists joined her cause, expanding the reach beyond just one city. Lisa received a commendation for her handling of the initial investigation. Her captain called her into his office and told her that she'd shown both courage and wisdom in a complex situation. She'd followed her instincts while respecting the rule of law, and that combination had made all the difference. But the real reward came 6 months later. Lisa was doing a routine follow-up visit to one of the reformed group homes, now under new management and meeting all safety standards. A boy around 12 years old approached her in the hallway. He looked at her for a moment, then said simply, "Thank you for listening." Lisa recognized him from one of the drawings she'd seen that night in the warehouse. His picture had shown the empty plates and the dark room. But now he looked different. His eyes were brighter, his posture more confident. He was wearing clean clothes and had gained some healthy weight. Most importantly, he was smiling. She knelt down to his level and told him that she was just doing her job, but that he and the other children were the brave ones for speaking up. He nodded and said they'd never stopped hoping someone would finally pay attention. Then he ran off to join some other kids heading to the recreation room. Lisa stood there in the hallway, watching the children play and laugh like kids should. The room they were in was bright and clean, nothing like those dark, neglected spaces from the photographs. This was how it was supposed to be. This was what justice looked like when it actually worked. She thought back to that night in the dark warehouse, when everything hung in the balance. The room had been dark, but the intentions of the people inside definitely weren't. They'd been shining a light on injustice, each in their own way. And sometimes, Lisa realized, darkness is just the absence of light waiting for someone brave enough to flip the switch.